Welcome to this explainer. Look, if you've ever had to suffer through one of those hollow corporate initiatives, those check-the-box exercises that go absolutely nowhere, well, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we're exploring a deeply substantive methodology from management expert Bill Schirkenbach. We're going to unpack exactly how he defines true strategic planning, anchoring the whole thing in what he calls the constancy of purpose process.
Schirkenbach points out that for years, strategic planning has carried a lot of heavy baggage, and to avoid that actual heavy lifting, management often opts for these lighter versions. You know the drill, like those classic two-day off-site retreats. It's like they pay for the full package, but they only take empty suitcases for show. So on the outside, it looks like strategic planning, but inside, it's completely empty.
Now, you might be wondering, if it's really that empty, why do leaders keep thinking it's working? Well, they suffer from a little something Schirkenbach calls superstitious learning. Basically, because they've had some success in the past, top managers confuse that past success with the effectiveness of their current strategies. The reality is, almost any theory can look like a stroke of genius during a temporary window of prosperity, right? But this superstitious learning blinds leaders. It stops them from asking the really tough question, how much better could things have been if they'd actually done the heavy lifting?
So to dismantle that illusion and build something real, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the strategic planning baggage. Second, defining constancy of purpose. Third, the 3 modes of change. Fourth, the 7-step process. And finally, taking strategic action.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the strategic planning baggage, lighter versions and empty suitcases.
To actually cure the symptoms of bad planning, we first have to recognize them. It's opting for those brief 2-day offsites instead of diving into real deep planning. It's the CEO delegating the heavy lifting rather than actively leading the charge. It's confusing temporary economic prosperity with sound management theory. But fundamentally, it's treating strategic planning like a superficial check-the-box exercise. People say, "Oh, do you do strategic planning?" You bet. Look, it's right here in this giant binder. But here's the thing, a binder is not a strategy.
Moving on to Section 2, defining constancy of purpose. Quality is made at the top. This is where Schirkenbach completely flips the script on how we define strategic planning. He says true strategic planning isn't just about a timeline, it's about your aim, and it has to be anchored by a constancy of purpose statement. Think of your vision as your superordinate aim, the idealized long-term goal. But to actually broadcast that vision, leadership has to hit 3 very specific frequencies. First, the mission hits the physical frequency, literally telling people what to do. Then values hit the emotional frequency, guiding your actions. And finally, questions hit the logical frequency. Now, hardly any organization thinks to provide a set of superordinate questions to guide the everyday thinking of their people, but Schirkenbach argues it is absolutely essential to the whole process.
Okay, Section 3, the 3 modes of change, a holistic framework for action. So why are those frequencies so important? Well, because throughout history, major change only happens when you hit 3 modes simultaneously: physical, logical, and emotional. Think about your own team at the office for a second. The physical folks, they need to literally see what they should do. The logical folks need to inquire about the underlying thinking behind the aim. And the emotional folks need to feel totally congruent with it. And there's absolutely no hierarchy here. Art, science, and psychology all intersect in this framework. If your strategic plan only addresses the logical side, or maybe just the physical side, it's going to fail. You've got to broadcast on all 3 frequencies to get anything meaningful done.
That brings us to Section 4, the 7-step process, the 50,000-foot view.
Now that we have the theory down, how do we actually build it? Taking a 50,000-foot view of this overarching process, you'll notice a really distinct flow. It starts right at the base with values and aim, feeds upward into creating the actual statement, moves over to key terms and measures, and ultimately links directly into the continual improvement process before it even rolls out. It's a completely interconnected, dynamic system aimed at aligning the whole organization. Let's break down exactly how these steps work.
Looking at steps 1 and 2, you'll see they actually happen concurrently. Step 1 is deeply introspective. It's an inward look at the people who had a great impact on you to define your personal value system. Step 2, on the other hand, looks outward. What was the founder's original aim? What major jolts has the organization had to survive? Because change is asymmetric, meaning the world rarely shifts in those predictable, balanced ways we might expect or hope for. As Schirkenbach bluntly puts it, the world changes, and you either adapt to it or you die.
Once you've looked inward and outward, you move on to steps 3 and 4. You draft that constancy of purpose statement, the vision, mission, values, and questions. But you definitely don't stop there. Most executive teams think, okay, the statement is drafted, our job is done. Schirkenbach says, no way. In step 4, you have to identify key terms. As Phil Caldwell at Ford taught him, every single word weighs a ton. You have to highlight words that are ambiguous and need logical definition, words that hold emotional energy, and words that are physically measurable to actually evoke action from your people.
And this naturally leads into step 5, bringing up the most common, fundamental question executives ask when they're trying to implement a new plan. What should I measure?
Schirkenbacher's pivot here is just brilliant. Instead of asking, what should I measure, he says you should be asking, what are your questions? He pushes back really hard against that old cliche, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Instead, he argues that your key measures have to originate directly from the key terms you just identified, and more specifically, from the logical questions that those terms generate.
This logic feeds directly into the management learning cycle. Think about it. Theory generates questions. Questions generate data. And the absolute only reason you ever collect data is to take action. Theory without action is pretty much useless, while action without theory is reactive, dangerous, and often really costly. Basically, your measurements mean absolutely nothing if they aren't answering the specific questions that are driving your overall theory of improvement.
And that connects us directly to step 6, linking everything to the continual improvement process. Once you have your measures, you have to identify the gaps. You find the gap between your goal and where you currently stand. Then you develop a solid plan to close it, and you proceed right around the classic plan, do, study, act cycle. This is exactly where high-level strategic planning physically links up to everyday tactical improvement across the entire organization.
Which brings us to step 7, the rollout. Now listen, this is far more than just a one-time event or a generic company-wide email. A true rollout requires committing at least 2 years of hard resources within your strategic window. By rolling this out, you are raising expectations of change, and you absolutely must back up that bluff with actual funding. I'm talking about resources for training, education, and process improvement across those physical, logical, and emotional chains of command.
Finally, Section 5, taking strategic action beyond the blueprint.
Look, a beautifully designed 7-step blueprint means absolutely nothing if it just sits on a dusty shelf in the corporate office. The absolute only reason for planning is to actually take strategic action. Leaders have to prove they are real and that they authentically live the constancy of purpose statement themselves. You've got to focus your communication across all 3 channels, physical, logical, and emotional, to make sure you reach absolutely everyone. And you need to build agile organizational designs that can withstand rapid political, economic, or natural upheavals, treating even short-term massive changes as deeply strategic moments.
So I'll leave you with this final thought. As you look at your own organization's planning processes, you really have to ask yourself, will you just continue to pack empty suitcases for show, or are you ready to do the heavy lifting and take real strategic action? Think about what frequencies you might be missing right now and how applying Schirkenbach's rigor could finally align your entire team. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.